The moment the letter arrived, Ethan Carter knew something was wrong, but he never expected a simple stone wall to start a neighborhood war. The quiet suburban street had always felt peaceful. Clean lawns, white fences, and friendly waves between neighbors. Ethan had lived there for 6 years without a single complaint. Then one morning, a formal envelope appeared in his mailbox. Inside was a notice from the Homeowners Association. It demanded that Ethan remove the retaining wall behind his house immediately. The letter claimed the wall violated HOA landscaping guidelines and created an unauthorized structure. Ethan stood in his backyard staring at the stone wall he had built 3 years earlier. It wasn't decorative. It had a purpose. Behind his property was a steep slope where rainwater flowed downhill from several neighboring yards. Without the wall, the soil would slowly slide into his backyard. That's why he had built it. The structure was solid. Carefully placed stone blocks reinforced the hill and kept the ground stable during heavy rain. But the HOA didn't care. Later that afternoon, Linda Pierce, the HOA president, arrived with a clipboard and a confident smile. She pointed at the wall like it was a crime scene. "Remove it within 7 days," she said calmly. Ethan tried explaining the situation, but Linda interrupted. "Rules are rules," she said firmly. What she didn't realize was that the wall wasn't only protecting Ethan's yard, it was holding back something much bigger, and if the HOA forced him to remove it, the entire neighborhood would soon discover exactly why it had been built. But no one knew that yet, not even Linda. For 2 days, Ethan tried to reason with the HOA. He sent emails, photos, and even the original landscaping report explaining the slope behind the homes. But every response was the same: the wall had to go. Linda Pierce made it very clear during the next HOA meeting. Standing confidently in front of several neighbors, she repeated the rule about unapproved landscape structures. Ethan calmly explained again that the wall wasn't decorative, it was structural. Without it, the hillside behind the properties could shift during storms. Some neighbors looked concerned, but Linda simply shook her head. "If everyone builds whatever they want," she said, "the neighborhood loses its standards." The room went quiet. Ethan realized something important in that moment. This wasn't about safety, it was about control. A few days later, a second letter arrived. This one was harsher. If the wall remained standing after the deadline, Ethan would receive daily fines. Standing in his backyard again, Ethan looked at the stone structure. He remembered the weeks he spent building it, hauling each block carefully into place. It had taken patience, but it had worked perfectly for 3 years. Now the HOA wanted it gone, so Ethan made a decision. If the HOA truly wanted the wall removed, he would remove it, exactly as requested. What happened next would prove that sometimes the things holding a neighborhood together are the ones people never notice. And once they're gone, everyone feels the consequences. 7 days later, Ethan started dismantling the wall. The morning sun was barely above the rooftops when neighbors noticed the change. Stone blocks that once held the hillside in place were stacked neatly beside Ethan's yard. A few curious neighbors walked over. "Are you really taking it down?" one asked. Ethan nodded calmly. "The HOA asked for it," he replied. Across the street, Linda Pierce watched from her driveway. She looked satisfied. To her, the situation was simple. Rules had been enforced, order had been restored. But Ethan worked slowly and carefully. He knew something the others didn't. As the final section of stone came loose, the slope behind the houses became exposed for the first time in years. Soft soil rested loosely on the hill. For a moment, nothing happened. The ground remained quiet. The neighbors slowly returned to their homes, and Linda walked back inside, confident the issue was finally over. But later that night, dark clouds rolled over the neighborhood. A steady rain began falling. Then it started pouring, hour after hour. Water soaked into the hillside. Without the retaining wall holding the soil in place, the ground began shifting, slowly, quietly, until the earth itself started moving, and by morning, the entire block would wake up to a problem no HOA rule had prepared them for. The rain finally stopped just before sunrise. When the first neighbor stepped outside, they immediately noticed something strange. The backyard slope behind several homes looked different. The soil had shifted overnight. Small cracks formed in the grass where the hillside had slowly settled. Ethan stood quietly near his window watching the scene unfold. Soon more neighbors came outside. Confusion spread across the block. Then someone noticed the edge of Linda Pierce's backyard. A section of her lawn had sunk slightly where the hill behind her property had begun sliding downward. It wasn't a disaster, but it was enough to cause concern. Linda stepped outside and stared at the uneven ground. Her confident expression slowly disappeared. Across the street, Ethan walked over calmly. He didn't say anything at first. The neighbors looked between them. Finally, Linda spoke. "What happened here?" she asked. Ethan looked toward the hill. "The retaining wall helped stabilize that slope," he explained gently. "Without it, rainwater can loosen the soil." The group fell silent. For the first time since the argument began, the HOA president seemed unsure, because suddenly the wall that had violated the rules had also been protecting the entire hillside, and now everyone was beginning to realize it. But the biggest surprise was still coming. Later that afternoon, an inspector from the city arrived. Several neighbors had reported the shifting hillside. The inspector walked slowly along the slope, studying the ground carefully. He asked a simple question: was there previously a retaining wall here? Ethan nodded. Linda crossed her arms but said nothing. After examining the area, the inspector explained something important. The slope behind the homes naturally directed rainwater downhill. Over time, water could soften the soil and cause gradual movement. A retaining wall helped prevent that. Without it, small shifts were possible during heavy rain. The neighbors exchanged uneasy looks. Suddenly the situation made sense. The wall hadn't just been a landscaping choice, it had been a protective barrier. Linda finally turned toward Ethan. "Why didn't you explain this before?" she asked. Ethan gave a calm answer: "I tried." The silence that followed was heavy, because everyone remembered the HOA meetings, the warnings, the fines, and the demand that the wall be removed. Technically, Ethan had followed every instruction perfectly. He had done exactly what the HOA asked. But now the neighborhood understood something unexpected. Sometimes rules can miss the bigger picture, and sometimes the quiet solutions people build are the ones holding everything together. Over the next few days, the neighborhood became unusually quiet. Neighbors spoke in small groups about the hillside and the missing wall. Everyone knew what had happened, and more importantly, why. Ethan didn't celebrate the situation. Instead, he continued maintaining his yard like always. One afternoon, Linda Pierce walked across the street toward his house. This time, she wasn't carrying a clipboard. She looked thoughtful. "I spoke with the city inspector again," she said. "He confirmed the retaining wall helped stabilize the hill." Ethan nodded quietly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Linda sighed. "It seems the HOA rules didn't consider situations like this." The tension that had filled the neighborhood for weeks slowly faded. Neighbors began discussing a simple solution: rebuilding the wall, but this time, with HOA approval, because now everyone understood its purpose. Sometimes communities learn lessons in unexpected ways, and sometimes the strongest foundations are the ones people only notice when they're gone. But one final decision would determine how this story ended. A week later, the HOA held another meeting, but this one felt very different from the last. Instead of arguments, the room was filled with calm conversation. Linda stood at the front of the room and addressed the neighbors. She explained the hillside issue and the importance of proper stabilization. Then she announced a new update to the HOA guidelines. Functional retaining walls designed for safety would now be allowed with approval. The neighbors agreed almost immediately. Ethan sat quietly as the vote passed. A few days later, the rebuilding began. This time, several neighbors helped carry stones and tools. The new wall stood stronger than before, carefully placed along the slope that protected the entire block. As the final stone settled into place, Ethan stepped back and looked across the neighborhood. Kids rode bikes down the street, neighbors waved, and the hillside stood firm once again. What started as a conflict had quietly turned into a lesson about listening, understanding, and seeing the bigger picture. Sometimes the things people fight against are the very things protecting them, and sometimes a single wall can hold more than soil. It can hold a community together, and that was the final twist in this unbelievable HOA story. If you love the drama, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment sharing your thoughts. It really helps this channel grow.